You're going to find this fascinating. What actually happened to the Titanic survivors? In the early hours of April 15, 1912, after colliding with an iceberg, the famous British passenger liner RMS Titanic sank to the ocean depths, taking with it 1,503 lives and leaving just 706 survivors. Whatever became of them after this tragedy? Well, some of them went on to live long and often incredible lives. Before we get into that, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so that you'll always be the first to see all our new videos. One of the most heartbreaking outcomes of the Titanic sinking was that it tore families apart. The Navertil brothers, Master Michael Marcel and Master Edmund Roger, were just 3 and 2 years old respectively when they boarded the Titanic with their father under the made-up names Lolo and Momon. So why all the secrecy? Well, their father, Mihaly, told everyone that he was a widower when, in fact, he had divorced his wife and took the kids without her knowing. As the Titanic was sinking, he put his boys in the last lifeboat with the final words, "My children, when your mother comes for you, as she surely will, tell her that I love her dearly and still do. Tell her I expected her to follow us so that we might all live happily together in the peace and freedom of the new world." Well, unfortunately, little Michael and Edmund didn't speak English at all, so it took quite some time to find their relatives. Their mother eventually saw them in the newspaper, and the family reunited a month after the tragedy. The brothers grew up to have completely different lives. Michael married his college sweetheart, became a professor of philosophy, spent the rest of his life in Montpellier, and died at the age of 92. Edmund also got married and worked as an architect and builder. During World War II, he fought with the French army, but was captured and taken prisoner. He escaped the camp, but due to his very weak health, he died at just 43 years old. The unsinkable Molly Brown, played by Kathy Bates in the 1997 award-winning film Titanic, is one of the most popular and liked characters in the movie. But this woman wasn't just thought up by some Hollywood screenwriter. She was a real passenger. Margaret Brown was known even before the Titanic for being one of the first women in the U.S. to run for political office 8 years before women even had the right to vote. She was in Europe when she found out that her grandson was really sick, so she decided to go to New York immediately. Because this decision was so last minute, very few people knew she was on board the Titanic. Once the ship struck the iceberg, Mrs. Brown selflessly helped other passengers into the lifeboat until she was eventually talked into getting into one herself. After being rescued by the RMS Carpathia, she organized a committee with other first-class survivors and Carpathia passengers that would raise money and provide counseling for the more destitute people that lived through the tragedy. Upon arriving in New York, she wouldn't leave the rescue ship until she made sure that every survivor received medical attention and found their families. Mrs. Brown was given a medal for her goodwill in helping the Titanic survivors. She was also later awarded the French Legion of Honor for her charitable work to rebuild France and help soldiers during World War I. The unsinkable Molly Brown died of a brain tumor at 65 years old. A truly extraordinary woman. Speaking of incredible women, over the course of her career working at sea, Miss Violet Constance Jessup survived not only 1, but 3 shipwrecks, the Titanic included. She started out as a stewardess on board the Olympic, which crashed into a British warship in 1911. Just 7 months later, she survived the Titanic, and then went on to serve as a nurse for the British Red Cross on the HMAS Britannic during World War I. This ship sank from an explosion, but Violet yet again came out of it and kept working at sea. This adventurous spirit finally settled down in Great Ashfield, England, where she died of congestive heart failure at the age of 83. Just like Margaret Brown, Violet was often jokingly called Miss Unsinkable. There's definitely truth to that. The actress Dorothy Gibson. Most famous for her role in the 1912 movie Saved from the Titanic, was actually one of the survivors of the catastrophe. She and her mom were coming back to the U.S. on board the Titanic after vacationing in Europe. The mother and daughter had been playing bridge with some friends when the ship struck the iceberg. They escaped together in the half-empty lifeboat number 7, but nearly sank again when one of the other survivors noticed a hole in the boat. Luckily, they were able to plug it with clothes. Not long after Gibson arrived in New York aboard the Carpathia, her agent convinced her to star in a movie about the Titanic sinking. She wrote the script herself and wore the same exact clothes in the movie that she did on the night of the disaster. The film came out just a month after the tragedy. Dorothy later gave up her acting career to work in the Metropolitan Opera. During World War II, when she was living in Italy, she was arrested by the Gestapo for being a rebel against the regime. She was imprisoned in San Vittore, in Milan, but managed to escape. She spent her last years in Paris and died of heart failure at 65. What a life! Professional tennis player Richard Norris Williams was on board the Titanic with his father. Given that the lifeboats, as many know, were reserved for women and children, these two guys were left to fend for themselves on a sinking ship. They did pretty well at first, but once the ship had sunk deep enough to leave the remaining passengers floating in the water, a huge smokestack collapsed and crushed Richard's father. Perhaps it was purely coincidental, or maybe something more, but the resulting wave washed Richard towards collapsible lifeboat A, so he climbed in. Unfortunately, that lifeboat was filled with freezing water that passengers had to stand in up to their knees. These survivors were later transferred to lifeboat number 14, but the damage of the cold water had already been done. Williams got frostbite on his legs, and once on board the Carpathia, the doctors recommended amputating both his legs. But the tennis star would have none of it, so he exercised every day and his legs slowly recovered. He even continued his tennis career, became an Olympic gold medalist, and served in the Army during World War I. He later became a successful investment banker and president of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Richard died of emphysema at the age of 77. Ava Miriam Hart was only 7 years old when she boarded the Titanic with her parents. According to Ava, her mother couldn't sleep at all the whole time she was on board because she'd had a really bad premonition about the trip. While the Titanic was sinking, Ava's father ran to their cabin, wrapped Ava in a blanket, and placed his wife and daughter in lifeboat number 14. The last thing he told Ava was, "Hold Mummy's hand and be a good girl." After the tragedy, Mr. Hart's body, even if recovered, was never identified. Ava went on to do many things throughout her life. She was a singer in Australia, a Conservative Party organizer in Britain, and a very outspoken activist when it came to the whole ordeal of the Titanic. She even wrote an autobiography called Shadow of the Titanic, a survivor story. Hart died 2 weeks after her 91st birthday. Remember the scene in the movie when that rich businessman snuck into one of the lifeboats? Well, that actually happened in real life. The guy's name was Joseph Bruce Ismay. He was the chairman of White Star Line, the company that operated the Titanic. Ismay was rescued in collapsible lifeboat C, and upon arriving in the U.S., he got a ton of heat for what he did. Dubbed the coward of the Titanic, Joseph received severe criticism from society and the press for leaving the Titanic while there were still women and children on board. After the Titanic, he tried to live his life on the lowdown. He continued dealing in maritime affairs, although not so much with passenger liners and more with the British Merchant Navy. Ismay died of stroke when he was 74 years old. So, which story moved you the most? Tell us in the comment section below. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. I'm sure they'll really enjoy hearing these survivors' fascinating life stories. Stay on the bright side of life, and we'll see you soon.